I'm going to talk to you today about the Web Authentication API. That lets you basically get rid of passwords. Who in the room has heard of that before today? That's a bit more than I thought. So what, 10? Who's used it in any capacity? Playing around with it, maybe watched a video on it, done anything. That's just one. I'm guessing that you haven't used it in production. I haven't either, so take with that what you want. But basically what I want you to get out of today is seeing how you can use it and why maybe you'd want to. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about what authentication is and the difference between authentication and authorization, why passwords suck. I'll talk a little bit about the API itself and maybe some things to think about if you're actually going to start using it. So authentication is basically proving who you are. That's different from authorization, which is whether you have permission to do something. And the way you would prove your identity is through something you know, like a password, something you have, like a device, that could be a phone or a computer, or something you are, like a biometric, for example, a fingerprint or your face. And most authentication ceremonies kind of start like this. Let's say we've got this guy here, and we'll call him Dave. And Dave wants to get into a nightclub. So to do so, he has to talk to a bouncer. The bouncer, when he gets to the front of the line, basically says, hold up, I need to check your ID. Dave shows it to him, and then the bouncer looks at it, says, yep, you're good to go. That's authentication. That's not necessarily the same as whether you're authorized to go in, which will be things like you're way too drunk to come in here, or you're not 18, maybe you're not on the list, or maybe you're wearing the wrong shoes. Now, the important thing here is the ID card, and what makes that something that we all trust? Well, in this case, let's say it's a driver's license. You know it's issued by the Department of Transport. And you know that to actually get one of those, you need to follow a few steps, so it's actually worth being an ID. And there are a few things on the card that help you figure that out as well. Things like your holograms or a picture of you. The fact that it looks like a driver's license. And passwords are bad for users, and they kind of work similar to a driver's license in that it's something you need to show to the person you're trying to authenticate with. In this case, you need to send your password to the website server. We're really bad at creating passwords. These are the top 10 passwords in order of their use. That first one is a horrible password. So is the second one, and the third and fourth, fifth, and so on. I don't really get the last one. How did Dragon make the list? It's nothing like the others. QWERTY is like, yeah, just run your fingers along the keyboard. But Dragon? I don't know. What was that? Maybe, yeah. So we're not good at creating passwords. We already know password with a little p and a little d and all that stuff is a bad password. But that's fine because we've got password complexity rules. We'll put a capital letter in or a number on the end. Maybe replace a symbol, and now we've got our perfect password. We're not good at remembering passwords. Because of that, you might go password 1, password 2. Or maybe you just use the same password on every site you use. And that means that if someone does get your password from a breach, for example, they can log into every account you've got. So it doesn't really work that well. I've reused passwords. Anyone in the room want to admit to it? There we go, look at that. Everybody. And if you do forget your password, then you've got to reset it. And if you work in a corporate environment or whatever, that's frustrating. You've got to call a help desk. I can't imagine being on a help desk doing reset passwords all day. So do you think you can trust people with your secrets? Secrets like your password. Does anyone in the room want to share one of their secrets with us? No, didn't think so. And it turns out that 81% of all hacking-related breaches are using a stolen password or a weak password. That's a lot of them. And a lot of those end up on this website, where I also appear several times, and that's why I don't like passwords anymore. So how do we deal with passwords generally? Normally go, oh, I don't like passwords, I don't want to do it, let's just get Facebook to store your passwords. And that's all well and good, because we assume that they know better than we do. But they're not really perfect either. They've all had issues where passwords have been revealed in plain text. And well, it's nice to think that that wouldn't happen to them, but they're still human, just like us, so it's going to happen. So that means social login is kind of out the door. Multi-factor authentication, you go, I get an SMS message every time that I log into on a new device. And that protects me from everything. But if you talk to Sean Kuntz, I'm sure he'll disagree with you because he lost 100 grand in Bitcoin because someone stole his phone number. And that's surprisingly easy to do. So that means multi-factor authentication isn't that great either. You might say, I got those one-time passwords and authenticator app, but you can still phish those because you just build a website that asks for them. Now, what if we didn't need to store passwords at all? This is where the Web Authentication API comes in. As I mentioned, it lets you use passwordless authentication, or it simplifies multi-factor authentication. And it does that by delegating the responsibility not to a social provider, but to something the user actually has, a physical device. And ultimately, it means you don't need to send your passwords or your other secrets over the internet. So how do I use it? You can use one of these. Who has a YubiKey or similar? Again, more than I thought. You guys are a good audience. It's like 5. I have one too. I have 2. If you're going to get one, get 2 because you want to keep one in a safe place in case you lose it. That's a good tip for if you're going to buy one. And this you'd call an external authenticator. You might also see it referred to as a cross-platform or a bound authenticator. Oh, sorry, a roaming authenticator. That's because you can use it between different devices. The other option is a fingerprint, or more specifically, a device that accepts a fingerprint to log in. I'm going to wager that more people have one of those. So that's really where this thing is actually useful. You can use your phone to log in, and that would be an internal authenticator or a platform or bound, because it's bound to your device. So when you get down to it, you want to see what it looks like when you use this thing. In this case, you can go to webauthn.io or any other number of demo sites, and you can enter your email and username or whatever it is, click register, you'll get a prompt that says, hey, insert your authenticator or tap your finger to your bioscanner or whatever. And then you might get a PIN, which is another level of authentication to prove that it is you. Then you have to touch it, and that's a registration. And to log in, same kind of thing. You don't need to enter any more details necessarily. You just touch your device. And that's kind of it. It's really simple, pretty low friction. That's all good. So what does that authenticator actually do? Well, there's a few things. Firstly, it verifies your identity. That's through that touch, which is, if you think back to something you have, something you own, this is proving that you have it because you can touch it. There's also a PIN, which is something you know, and or a biometric, which is something you are. So you kind of get 2 factors in one, which is why it's safer than simply having a password. Then it will store a credential on itself, and it will scope that credential to the one website that you've used, and only that website, which means that you can't phish that because the authenticator itself won't give you that information for a website that you're not on. That kind of means it's phishing resistant. I call it unphishable, but I don't think the security researchers will, because I think they're still afraid of what they call the Titanic unsinkable. And that credential is basically an asymmetric key pair where you've got a public key and a private key. The private key stays on the device because it's private, and the public key is public, so it gets sent away to essentially the website server. Can I use it? You know, it's pretty new. Only a few of us had heard of it. So what's the browser support like? If you go to Can I Use, you can see lots of green, which is good. This view shows each browser, and the height is how much it's used. The numbers in there are different versions. So it's been supported in Chrome for a while, and Firefox for a while as well, not at all in Safari, which brings us to Australia, where we love we love iOS phones, and as a result, it's available for actually a lot less than the global average. So, you know, we're behind the global average and another thing. If we look at what that means overall, basically if you're using Chrome or Firefox, you can use the external authenticators or the internal ones on pretty much any device you've got, unless it's an iPhone or an iPad, I guess, which is good. And even though there's this big gap in iOS, we've still made good progress in a year. You know, a year ago, it looked more like this. So one sunny day in April, I don't actually know if it was sunny, but let's say it was, Android decided that, hey, how about we make every Android 7 Plus device be capable of this fingerprint login thing? And now we have that. And one day, Apple will do the same with iOS, and everyone will be happy because we'll go from, let's say, 30% to 80% or something like that, which will be pretty good. It's a little bit of a roller coaster, and I don't know if you can guess, but I have no idea why they're wearing VR goggles. But essentially, this just means you can still build it for users. Everything in there is feature detectable, and it doesn't take anything away from the existing experiences you've built. So the way you do it, essentially there's a JavaScript API, and there are 4 methods that you call. One to figure out if it's supported in the browser, another to see if you've got one of those platform authenticators, if your device itself can act as an authenticator, one to create, and one to get those credentials. You'll see those little options parameters. I don't have time to go through them, but if you go to webauthn.guide, that goes through them all pretty well. Yeah, basically it's just the information that gets sent around, things like what kind of authenticators you'll accept. So how do we make it better for people to actually use? Well, you've got to think about a few things. There's registration, there's login, managing those credentials, and account recovery. If you're going to change how you do login with passwords, you've got to think about all the things you currently use passwords for. So if you're going to register, what information do you want to collect? You've probably got standard things like a username or an email address, a name, and a password. You have to decide if you want to use passwordless login or just as a second factor. Figure out if a password is still required based on that. But then also, if you still want to allow a password. For example, I might say I want to go passwordless, but still let people have a password, which might help deal with some of the other issues we'll talk about later on. And then whether or not you want to register that token now or later. I would suggest later because it adds a bit of friction to the thing. You have to consider more things like, what if they stop at that point? Then they've got this orphaned authenticator. You also got existing users to think about. So how do you get them using it? You might want to put a hint on the login page or a prompt after they've actually logged in to say, hey, you can do this thing with your device now. If you're going to do that, you've got to think about what kind of messages you want to actually appear on those screens, or how forceful you want to be with getting people to start using this thing. How long does that remind me later button remind you for? If you've got login, then you might need to change that screen too. You don't necessarily have a password anymore if you're going to go passwordless. You can also go usernameless. The browser support isn't great today, but with the next versions of Chrome and Firefox, it gets a bit better. They start supporting it. At the moment, it's only Edge. So you might want to. It's probably not going to help. When you want to manage your authenticators, you're probably going to need to display something about those authenticators. So you might have a nickname for it. Yeah, I can put the name of my device, when I last used it, which might help me decide that if I haven't used it in a while, I want to get rid of it. And maybe you prompt them to do that for their own security, essentially. If you don't have your device, then you've got a few problems as well. If you're using the bound authenticators, then you can't really do much else with those. You can't use that on another device. So this is where my password backup example comes in. But another option is something like if you have a magic link, like Slack would send you to log into on a new device. If you're going to do that though, have you stored their email? And then have you verified that email? Because you don't want them entering any old email. It might go to the wrong person. So what have other people done? I've talked a lot about what we could do, but what's actually out there now? These guys, Google, Facebook, GitHub, Twitter, Dropbox, Microsoft, 1Password, LastPass, all those people. A lot of places have actually started implementing this thing. None of them have gone the whole hog. They're all going for it as a second factor, which kind of gets around a lot of those security concerns and user experience concerns as well. They don't need to change their login page. They've probably already got fallbacks for things like using a different two-factor authentication method, maybe use an authenticator falling back to an SMS. This is just an extra one. That kind of means they get around a lot of those problems. But if I was going to do it, I'd probably try and go the whole way. I don't know how well it'd work, but if I had both options, then no one loses anything, right? So to recap, I guess, I talked a little bit about the problems with what we're doing now. We've got passwords that can be hacked and phishing attacks and all those kind of things. I talked a little bit about how web authentication is easy, at least if you've got the platform authenticators. Browser support is not great for iOS. Interestingly, iOS 13 is coming out and it's not in that. but it might be in 13.1. So yeah, we'll see. Talk a little bit about what to build for today and some things to think about for tomorrow. Thank you.